I want to welcome everybody to this class. This is the most highly unusual class I think we've ever had in terms of composition. We are really privileged to be able to have this series of classes by Milt on U.S. labor history, and this is actually part 6. He's been going through the decades, starting with the time of the Bolshevik Revolution. So Milt this week is going to be doing the 1970s and 1990s, I guess almost up to the present. Which way for the AFL-CIO, class collaboration or class struggle? And I just wanted to point out that several people who normally attend this class are in a Latin America Solidarity planning meeting. But we wanted to go ahead with this because we are not only making these classes available to those who attend, but because, you know, we're able to videotape it, thanks to Joe, we're sending them out to the branches, and they're also being transcribed for a future book. So we wanted to continue to make sure we do these classes at least once a month. And so because of our very busy schedule the next 3 weeks, with next week is the anti-draft conference on Saturday, the following Saturday is a Mumia demonstration, and the following Sunday is the May Day demonstration. We will not be having another class until probably May 7th. We may try to have some classes on Thursday to make up for the fact that we're going so long without classes, but as far as a Saturday class, we won't be holding one until May 7th. So I'm just going to turn the mic over to Milt.
Thank you, Sharon. And I'd like to start out by refreshing the discussion we had at the last meeting in order to get a sense and a measure of what the 70s to the 90s unfolded in terms of the struggle and the class collaboration from a labor bureaucracy. The post-Second World War and the period of the Korean War and the McCarthy period that ushered in the witch hunt in the labor movement is primarily what we're discussing, in my judgment, weakened the labor movement for years that followed. The reason I'm raising this is because the period I just mentioned weakened the relationship of the communist movement that had played, along with our, those we followed, played a historic role during the 30s that ended with the Second World War. And they and we were driven out of the labor movement by a combination of factors. One was the collaboration of the labor bureaucracy with the government during the Second World War. Took official positions in the war defense boards and other agencies of government to exhort the workers to produce more in the name of fighting fascism and protecting democracy, which in essence was a war over markets between imperialist rivals. In addition to that attack, the collaboration, I should say, the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, that had played such a heroic role in the 30s, bent to this patriotic and encourage the workers to work harder, to support a wage freeze, to remain on your jobs, increase productivity, and so on. So the CIO got weakened along with the Communist Party that also joined in this patriotic fever and supported the no strike pledges as well. So by time the 1950 came around, the CIO, under the pressure, along with the AFL that hadn't yet merged until 1955, the CIO began to carry out the government mandate to rid the communist movement of influence in the labor movement. And the CIO bent to that under the leadership of Phil Murray, who took over from John L. Lewis. He was the president of the United Steelworkers. And what they did is they began to expel left-wing unions that was influenced by the communists, so that unions that fought heroic struggles of the 30s, like the mine, mill, and smelter, the United Electrical Workers, the Textile Workers Union, and other unions that reflected the industries where the communists in New York were strong, as well as in other parts of the country. The only union that didn't bend to this witch hunt and the CIO was the International Longshore Workers Union, which we're working with now in regard to the Million Worker March. They maintained their integrity and held the line, but the rest of the development was splits and expulsions, so that by time the end of the Korean War and the end of the Eisenhower administration that was behind this, that bent the CIO and the AFL, had already done their damage. So we look at that period as how to reconstitute the communist influence that we represent back into the movement. And it is a torturous, as we learn from our classes, as to how the communist influence can maintain its relationship with the trade union movement as a result of what I just described. It's a torturous task, difficult and complex. Now, in 1955, and then I'll finish with this period because I want to get back to the 70s, the AFL-CIO merged, and we all looked at it as a positive development because it brought numbers together. Millions of AFL that were from the craft unions with the CIO that was even smaller numerically, but much, much more militant. But since the CIO was weakened, the merger of the AFL-CIO what it didn't do, even though it merged, was produce a left development. It didn't. George Meany became the head of it. He competed with Walter Reuther from the UAW that represented the CIO. And Walter Reuther had already purged communists from the UAW from the days following the sit-downs, the heroic sit-downs. So that Walter Reuther, who was competing with Meany for the presidency of the AFL-CIO, was already cleansed and showed his loyalty to the politics of the AFL-CIO. The result is that Meany, the most anti-communist, the most class collaborationist leader of the AFL, the Meany who said he boasted he'd never been on a picket line in his life, he collaborated with the government in all the assassinations that the CIA and the State Department were carrying out against the revolutionary and liberation movements, he sat on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy, which I'll go into later, to show how they collaborated and how it affected the political development of the workers inside the trade unions. And of course, in the contracts that were coming up, there was always the concessions that were demanded and the bending by the AFL-CIO. Here comes 1970, and that pattern had existed. But something happened in 1970 that opened up the class struggle. And I think it's important to take note, if I can find what I'm looking for, here it is that when I studied, and I'll pass it around, the work stoppages, which is very important, and we'll go into why important strikes are. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. When I looked at the years from 1947 all the way to 2003, each year, when you come to 1970, there were 2,468,000 workers who stopped work in plants that had over 1,000 members in the industry. Yeah, 1970 was the highest point since 1947 of work stoppages involving 1,000 workers or more. The accumulation of them was the total was over 2.5 million workers involved in that. It never reached that height. So what was going on in 1970 that's very important for us? Because when there's an increase in strikes, this is for revolutionaries, this is very important. When the Russian Revolution took place, Leon Trotsky and Lenin wrote in one of his introductions the increase in strikes that motivated the strategic conception that when was it proper to seize power. Now, I would like to turn to something Lenin wrote, an essay back right before the 1895 revolution. He wrote it about 5 years earlier. It's Essays on Strikes. And Jesse was nice enough to Xerox the material and read a section of it so that we get a full measure, because in my judgment, what Lenin said is really the best thesis I've read on the nature of strikes and how important they are. Jesse?
However, on this page, the Xerox, the 3 pages beginning, page 61. Okay. However, strikes which arise out of the very nature of capitalist society signify the beginning of the working class struggle against that system of society. There is no wealth, and I'm skipping to the next underlined sentence area. There is no wealth that can be of benefit to the capitalists if they cannot find workers willing to apply their labor power to the instruments and materials belonging to the capitalists and produce new wealth. Skipping to the next underlined section. But when the workers state their demands jointly and refuse to submit to the money bags, They cease to be slaves. They become human beings. They begin to demand that their labor should not only serve to enrich a handful of idlers, but should also enable those who work to live like human beings. And then next underscore section. Strikes, therefore, always instill fear into the capitalists because they begin to undermine their supremacy. Quote, all wheels stand still if your mighty arm wills it, close quote, a German worker's song says of the working class. Should I go into the next page? Okay. So on the next page, once again, the underlined section. Every strike reminds the capitalists that it is the workers and not they who are the real masters. The workers who are more and more loudly proclaiming their rights. Every strike reminds the workers that their position is not hopeless, that they are not alone. And skipping down to the next underlined section. Every strike means many privations for the working class. Terrible privations that can be compared only to the calamities of war, hungry families, loss of wages, often arrests, banishment from the towns, so on and so on. And then the next underscore. It is often enough for one factory to strike, for strikes to begin immediately in a large number of factories. What a great moral influence strikes have, how they affect workers who see that their comrades have ceased to be slaves, and if only for the time being, have become people on an equal footing with the rich. And then the next underlined section. A strike teaches workers to understand what the strength of the employers and what the strength of the workers consists in. It teaches them not to think of their own employer alone and not of their own immediate workmates alone, but, and then I should probably have underlined a little bit more, but of all the employers, the whole class of capitalists, and the whole class of workers. So just add that part to the underscore. And then I'm going to skip to the next part. A strike, moreover, opens the eyes of the workers to the nature not only of the capitalists, but of the government. And then the next page, bottom left-hand side. Strikes, therefore, teach the workers to unite. They show them they can struggle against the capitalists only when they are united. Strikes teach the workers to think of the struggle of the whole working class against the whole class of factory owners and against the arbitrary police government. This is the reason that socialists call strikes, quote, a school of war, close quote, a school in which the workers learn to make war on their enemies for the liberation of the whole people, of all who labor, from the yoke of government officials and from the yoke of capital. And then it goes to strikes are one of the ways in which the working class struggles for its emancipation, but they are not the only way. And if the workers do not turn their attention to other means of conducting the struggle, they will slow down the growth and the successes of the working class.
Okay. Well, enough couldn't be said any better by anyone since Lenin made that comment. I just want to repeat the last part of what Jesse said. The strike is the war, not the war itself. See, it's the education of the workers. See, toward the class war, because it teaches them all these things and needs a broader political basis for its liberation that goes beyond the trade unions themselves. This is a communist view, see, not a social democratic view, because Lenin was really arguing against the social democrats when he wrote these essays, because economism was very strong prior to 1895, because the workers all of a sudden were coming out from under the repression of the Tsar and struggling, and the strikes were rapidly developing. Now, there's something unique about the U.S. labor capital, and that is that the U.S. has the bloodiest history of any industrial imperialist nation in the world. The history of labor capital struggles is the bloodiest in this country and the most violent, both from our class and theirs. That's unique in many ways. And of course, this class is not to go over that history. We've covered some of it in the earlier struggles of the 1900s, the Ludlow massacre, and Colorado miners that worked for Rockefeller, and then we could go on to the Haymarket in Chicago. So we're in that kind of a relationship in our struggle against capital as communists. 1970 ushered in a very interesting development, as I mentioned, about the amount of strikes and workers who, over 1,000 who went through work stoppages. In March of 1970, postal workers had no rights. They were strictly under government control, with poor wages, working conditions that were incredible, and bound by law, the Constitution, and Nixon in particular, who was the President of the United States, and who we know his position on the trade unions, on labor. Nevertheless, a group of rank and file that started here in the Grand Central Station decided enough is enough, and they walked out. It was a wildcat strike. The union that was a federal union under the AFL was totally opposed to the strike, ordered them back to work. They refused. And within 6 days, it spread nationally to over 100 and some odd thousand of these postal workers, about 118,000. The Nixon administration had initiated, following the Vietnam War. The war it was winding down, but Nixon was still bombing North Vietnam there and Cambodia. But Vietnam vets were coming back from the war, and many of them had to work in the postal workers. Were postal workers, and the years that they served in the Vietnam War, the law required that they give them no seniority rights, that they fought in Vietnam to add. So what happened was, Nixon was so furious, he brought out the National Guard and federal troops to run the mail service. And they packed them up in Grand Central Station. We were involved. The party was involved in this. We used to be on the handout leaflets, trying to reach the public to get support. We went on picket lines. We were downtown constantly when demonstrations took place. Huh? Yes, yes, right. Well, in 6 days, with the National Guard and federal troops taking over to run the mail service, it was dead on arrival. Nothing moved. And you know, when nothing moves in the mail service, just to give you an example, all the transactions of Wall Street see, and the exchange markets, and the letters of correspondence and so on, at all ends. Wall Street was out of business for 6 days. And they finally decided it wasn't going to work. The government coming in with all that power couldn't replace what started out to be about 1,800 workers who started the New York Wildcat. Nixon appealed to the patriotism of the Vietnam vets. That didn't work. He appealed to the constitutional violations that they were subjected to as federal workers. Nothing worked. So they decided to settle it. And out of that settlement came the American Postal Workers Union, the National Association of Letter Carriers, the Mail Handlers Union, all these unions that were never getting all the previous union, the craft union, that never was given service. All of a sudden these unions were born to show that a small group of workers at the proper moment, and the moment was timely. Why? Is because Nixon had initiated what he called a wage price freeze of the 70s. I was involved in that wage price freeze when I was negotiating a contract with the New School for Social Research, and this is just something that I enjoyed. I was sitting at the table, and all of a sudden I knew management because the lawyers, we were all familiar with each other, and all of a sudden some burly guy walks in, young guy, and sits down at the table across the way from us. So I said to the head of the local, who is this guy? And he said he didn't know. So we asked him, and he said, I'm from the government. And we said, well, what are you doing at the negotiating table of we're a private sector local bargaining with a school. And he said, well, I want to lay down the terms of the Nixon wage price freeze. That broke off all our negotiations. We all walked out, and we said, until you get rid of this guy, we cannot bargain. This was all over the country. Nixon was sending everybody in to keep the wages down. The price, though he called it a wage price freeze, nevertheless, there was no price freeze, as we all know. And the cost of living went up and inflation intensified. So it showed how workers, whether they're in small locals or in small groups, can fire up if it's timely. Something that even shut down the government. Now that's very unusual. So that set the tone to some extent for the 70s. And the strike level kept up for the entire decade. Now comes the 80s. I'm skipping a little to the 80s. I want a lot of discussion so that. What was the 80s? The 80s was an effort to reverse the 70s. And by my strike statistics that I can describe to you, the level of strike activity went way, way down for the 1,000 workers who worked in plants. It ushered in the Reagan administration, 1980. Reagan became president. And the first thing that happened was breaking the Patco strike. That set the tone for the entire labor movement to take note that what you did in the 70s is not permissible in the 80s. See? Now, if you ask any worker what he remembers about the Reagan administration and labor, he'll tell you the Patco strike. The Patco was, was broken. The union was broken. Not my intention to go into that if we want to later to discuss why the AFL-CIO allowed this to happen and why PATCO itself could be completely broken in an industry and a skill that was very unique, being a controller. But there was something else that happened in 1985 that nobody, if you mentioned it, nobody would remember in the labor movement, but communists remember. And that was a strike that took place in Austin, Minnesota by a local called P9. They were members of the United Food and Commercial Workers. And at that time, the meatpacking industry was going through some tremendous technological changes and restructuring, similar to what's happening to the airlines industry today. You can remember, if you're my age, well, you might remember Swift, you might remember all these companies, I have a list of them here, that existed at that time, that no longer exist. Armour, Swift, Rath, Cudahy, No, Smithfield is still alive down in Raleigh. They recouped, you're right, though. Bankruptcies began to occur, restructuring. So here comes along a small local. Again, I want to emphasize small locals. P9 couldn't have had more than, maybe 1,700 workers. And what happened is that in all this restructuring, layoffs, reopening of contracts, downsizing of benefits, wages got reduced in some cases down to $7 an hour. And that's for meat packing, heavy work. So in September of '84, when all this was happening, a group of housewives of the husbands that worked in the packing house plant decided to start informational picketing of what the Hormel was doing. Hormel was the corporation, was doing. And they would come out a couple of times a week and hold up signs and so on. And little by little, they developed a strategy, and they developed it around a headquarters of P9 called the Austin Labor Center. And they invited workers to come to Austin, which is only a city of maybe 23,000 people. And lo and behold, thousands of workers, when they got the word, began to come to Austin. The party sent Shelley, who went there because we were very interested in building the solidarity for this local. At the beginning of the strike, the UFCW leadership supported it. But as time went by, the local that was under a new leadership, led by, we met him when he came to New York and spoke at District 65, which doesn't exist anymore, UAW, down at Union, where was, down at, Where 65 was? 65 is down by, I think it's down, yeah. We met Jim Guyette, who was the president of the union, and he wanted to open up a struggle against a bank that was supporting Hormel and providing them with resources and money called the Union Bank or something like that. And he hired a guy named Ray Rogers, who the labor movement hated his guts. And Ray Rogers initiated this great campaign that caught the imagination of the country. See? And out of it came a very unique strategy of adopt a P9 family. And people began on a one-on-one basis to connect, because the International said, if you continue the strike, or picketing, rather, I should say, against this bank, we're disassociating from the strike. And they did. They cut off funds. The UFCW cut off funds, and subsequently they replaced Guyette with a trustee. And in time, after months, they made a settlement. I shouldn't say they broke the union. They didn't, because the union was reconstituted under a trusteeship. And they settled it. The point I'm making about this is that here we had class struggle versus class collaboration. See? When a group of workers in a small local decided to spread the strike and to move against a larger section of the ruling class that's intertwined into corporate America, they said this was a secondary boycott, it was against the law, and therefore you have to give it up, and so on, and if you don't, they did remove the funds, and as I say, put this in trusteeship. Again, a small group of workers, maybe 17 or 1800, galvanized thousands of workers to come to the Austin Center out of solidarity, started by a group of women who was picketing the Hormel plants. That was the high point of the lessons of the relationship of a bureaucracy that deals and is intertwined into law, government law, and government relationships, and corporate friends, and workers who want to struggle on an independent basis and are willing to clash with any section of the ruling class that stands in their way. Well, along comes, before the end of the 80s, along come another struggle. It started in 89. And it was called the Pittston Strike. And did we Xerox some of that? Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. Well, when the Pittston Strike started, and Pittston was one of these more highly technological. It wasn't like you were digging coal deep in the mines. Pittston was a different kind of plant. It was highly technologically developed. As a matter of fact, after this struggle was broken, not broken, it was settled, I should say, the government invited the Soviet Union to this plant to show them, see, how Soviet bureaucracy, how it works, and how they should learn from the U.S., see. Because the mines in the Soviet Union, as was here too in an earlier period, was explosive, lots of accidents, and so on. Now, the 1,700 Pittston workers, 1,700 in this local, were working for about a year without a contract. And they decided on April 5th, 1989, to go on strike. And when the miners go on strike, it has a whole history, as we discussed in our earlier classes, of militancy and solidarity and a tradition of fight back. Now they worked, they went on strike and didn't get a contract for a year, as I said. And they opened up what we called, and you'll see it in that front page, the Solidarity Center. And once again, taking it from the lessons to show how each experience is somehow gets into the minds of others. So what happened at the Austin Labor Center happened in Pittston, down in West Virginia. I think it was, it's on the page there, the city. And thousands of people, it was a camp, and Pittston workers and miners invited everybody to come down. Thousands came down, just like they did for the P9. See? And then on a certain day, in a late afternoon, 98 miners and a preacher decided to walk into this very modern, highly industrialized mine, processing mine, coal mining processing. They took the advanced security guards that had been surrounding the plant and walked right through and got inside the plant and told them to get the hell out of that plant. All the advance guards that were protecting the property of Pittston, they told them to get out or else. And they went out. The property was more important to Pittston than making a showdown with workers who were on the property and mad. Huh? The vans? No. The workers decided on what they called a tactic of non-violence on the property, which was the right thing to do because they don't want to destroy the property. That we go back to the levelers, which is not the way, meaning that the problem is the machinery and the property on the machine, rather than the class that rules and exploits the workers. No, they went on with a kind of a Martin Luther King spirit. And they stayed there for 4 days. And the word got around nationally. And thousands of workers came down because Virginia is a right-to-work state, as I can see from the two comrades here who came out of Virginia. And the cops and the guard, they brought in the sheriffs. They had hundreds and hundreds of police coming in to threatening the miners, and thousands, including our own comrades, were down there to make sure that the workers were protected. Then the court moved in, fined them millions of dollars a day, threw a number of the leaders who were off the property, but they said they planned it, in jail, and a whole attack, a repressive attack. But the workers didn't come off the property until 4 days later. And what happened was, and by the way, this is important, Rich Trumka, who was president of the union, who finally got this top job with Sweeney now, and probably being groomed to be the next head of the AFL-CIO, if Sweeney declines. They gave him credit for this. He had nothing to do with it. The leader was someone named Cecil Roberts, who is now the president of the union. We met with him because they sent up a couple of miners. One was one of the first black miners to New York to kind of raise money because of all the fines that had been imposed on the union. And we took these two miners around because the AFL-CIO didn't want to touch it. And Key Martin and myself, and I remember Phil Olato, comrades, We took them to a number of the unions, and we raised thousands of dollars. Particularly Local 100 of the TW was very supportive. Now, the end of that strike brought a settlement. And once again, Trumka, who didn't have much to do with it, they were looking for a way to settle this, and as a result, the 98 workers walked off the property after 4 days based upon the pressure that came from some of the top leaders who were in dispute with the militants. Once again, here we see a small group of workers fighting against concessions and for a decent contract, being also having to deal with a labor bureaucracy that's interested in a deal and perhaps some concessions to end the strife. And that ended in 1989. Now, quickly, the third struggle that I want to mention, I guess, is a similar kind of struggle, but it took place at the beginning of the 90s, toward the end of the 90s, in Flint, Michigan. Now, Flint, Michigan is a very unique city. It was the birth of the CIO, the birth of the sit-downs in auto that spread to other cities. And here again was a small local. I think the local was no more than less than 2,000. It was constituted, there were 2 locals, not one, that were in Flint. And I just wanted to mention something that I missed here. Oh, that's all right. It's part of the history of Pittston. Just to remind, negotiators reached a settlement December 31st, 1989, which included a few of the concessions that Pittston had demanded. So you see, the issue is the struggle to resist concessions and how we see it now. It's come home to roost in the contemporary 21st century, where labor continually is forced into a concessionary position. Now, this Flint strike was 1998. This is the last, I'm sorry? The one I'm talking about was in 1998. It was a 54-day strike that began much earlier by the 2 locals. That's the strike. Why? You look puzzled? It might have been earlier than, no, I got a date from my own article of August 13, 1998, but this is after the strike was settled that I wrote this article on global restructuring as a result of what happened in Flint. I'll check it. It might have been earlier. But what made this strike in Flint of 2 locals against General Motors so significant? And Diane Mathewitz, who was a comrade, who was a General Motors worker, and still is, in Atlanta, had written extensively on this strike and had been organizing solidarity for the Flint workers. Now, how is it possible that 2 Flint locals, and they totaled 9,200 workers, were able to shut down GM's entire North American empire, costing the largest corporation in the world at that time over $3 billion in lost production. It was once again the feelings of workers around the country in UAW that felt the same exploitation, the same pressure, the same intensity of working in intense heat, production lines that were almost inhuman in terms of increasing productivity, as opposed to Ford and at that time Chrysler, as well as the auto plants and transplants and around the world. It was incredible the amount of support and solidarity that grew overnight. And it was a strike that took not only a form against GM in terms of their conditions here at home, but it was also a fight against the global anti-globalization of being able to exploit auto workers around the world, in Brazil where they opened up plants and other places. So exploitation that affected Brazilian workers, for example, that were doing the same kind of work, created in our minds, the party, the term the socialization of labor. That is, that through the process of global industrialization and exploitation, that it lays the basis for socialism. And the socialization is that each worker knows exactly, you may speak another language, but you can describe the work that would be understood by any worker, whether they're in Indonesia, wherever GM had opened a plant to take advantage of lower wages and better and more profits. So this strike that went on for 54 days shut down not only these two Flint plants, but shut down the entire industry, the GM. And what was one of the significant weaknesses of General Motors that the workers caught on to right away? It's called online inventories. That is, that in order to cut costs, GM kept a low level of inventories, and through computerization and their dealers and their suppliers, they could immediately move cars without having to stock them in warehouses or in where they would be costly. So when the strike developed for this length of time, they ran out of parts, they ran out of everything, and were forced under those circumstances also to settle. And of course, the leadership of the International, the union, was someone named Jokic, who was the international president, and his cohort, Shoemaker, who was the GM division union leader, were looking for the settlement when the strike was very strong. See? And so we see that in this strike, not only was there a small group of workers that can shut down an empire, but also there's a labor bureaucracy that was looking to settle on the terms that would get it over with, because they're not happy with strikes. It makes them either move against the employers, it makes them deal with the workers, it makes them have to make plans for paying more strike benefits or whatever else the costs are. It upsets the very stability of a labor bureaucracy that Trotsky once called the labor lieutenants of capital. And that still exists. So it also had an effect upon other corporations, this strike. Motorola in those days, Sunbeam, Nabisco, these were all conglomerates that owned companies that were related to the industry. Anyway, the workers were able to get some benefits from the strike based upon the speed up layoffs and so on that GM had initiated. And there's one more important point about this that we had discussed years ago when Sam was alive. GM decided in the middle of the night at one of the Flint plants to remove the equipment because they were deciding to shut the Flint plants down. And the workers became immediately aware of it because they're the ones that have to move the equipment as to where it's going, by rail or wherever. And that initiated the strike too. That was a factor, a very strong factor. They told GM not to move that equipment out because it meant they were going to shut those plants in Flint down. And the workers decided to strike. In about the second or third week of that strike, when GM began to blink, the workers, the leaders from the locals in Flint said to GM, if you want to show good faith, bring back all that machinery and put it back in the plant. GM agreed. And they brought all that equipment back, put it in the plant, and the workers felt they weren't going to shut it down. See, they weren't going to export it, see, or move it to another part of the country under its restructuring conception in those days where high tech and low pay, which Sam had written on, had a deep effect upon the auto industry. See, that's a very important aspect of plant shutdowns that we raised, that the workers are the first ones who know about when a plant is going to get shut down. And that should get around immediately. Now, we raised a proposal of a pre-notification legislatively, that workers had the right to a 60 or 80-day pre-notification. That meant that they would be prepared if a plant was going to get shut down. And it passed. That pre-notification became the law. Although it concerns a certain amount of workers in a plant as to whether they have to initiate the pre-notification. Well, I'm going to end, even though I would have liked to talk about the UPS strike, which later developed. I'll wait that for another time, because it was a very important strike, and we were involved in it. I was in touch with Ron Carey, who at the time was the president. Well, let me just summarize it, because I like discussion. See? Oh, I have one more point. Yeah, sure. Okay? All right. I want to go back to the 80s for a moment. And Reagan. Reagan initiated and got Congress approval of an organization that was founded in 1983. Oh, thank you. That was founded in 1983, called the National Endowment for Democracy. And the Congress approved the law that creating them. It was an act of Congress. And yet, it became one of the most secret organizations to supply the resources, the funds that developed counter-revolution all over the globe. Worked closely with the CIA, the State Department, to initiate, in the name of democracy, counter-revolution. They did it in Poland, they did it in Nicaragua. I can go through, they did it in the Congo, they did it in every area of the world where there was a movement for either liberation or for independence, or with some anti-imperialist leaders or groups that were seeking power. And George Meany, who was president of the AFL-CIO, as I described, became a member. He sent in one of his cohorts to be a member of the National Endowment for Democracy because they funded the AFL-CIO. And the funds that the AFL-CIO got from the government and through the NED was huge. Huge amounts of money, millions of dollars over years. And the AFL-CIO sat next to one of the leading, leaders of the NED. His name was Paul Wolfowitz. See? Now you can see the treachery here. They set up 4 different divisions within the AFL-CIO covering Latin America, Africa, Asia. And they were a party. The AFL-CIO was a party to this. The leaders were. It was secret. And it points up how important it is for the movement, the labor movement today, to pursue an independent class line, to break with all both the class collaboration and these government-sponsored counter-revolutionary developments. The latest one is Venezuela. See? It was clear. And Meany had died. Kirkland had taken over, Lane Kirkland had taken over from Meany in about 1987 after this, what they call the Solidarity Center of the AFL-CIO was formed, and Lane Kirkland even intensified his relationship with the NED, State Department, and the CIA until Sweeney took over in 1995, the present AFL-CIO leader. And he promised Sweeney promised that he would break with it. See, as one of his reasons. He didn't. He just changed the name. See, and now they call it the American Center for International Labor Solidarity, ACILS. And as I described, he played a role in the Venezuela counter-coup, the AFL-CIO, which is exposed. Now there's an interesting development that didn't happen for many, many years. And that is, there's resistance inside the AFL-CIO to this treacherous relationship. And it's stemming from the California state AFL-CIO. They demanded that Sweeney send out the head of this ACILS, and by the way, it's over 2.3 or 4 million that are in the state AFL-CIO in California. And there's a lot of support for it, to demand that Sweeney break with the National Endowment for Democracy. And it's beginning to take form. And we're following it very carefully because the issues that I'm raising today, which is that history has confirmed over and over again in the class struggle that it's the workers and the oppressed that the struggle will emanate from below. If anything, the examples I gave and the lessons of the 80s, the 70s, 80s, and 90s is that this is a historical truth. And that it really confirms what Marx and Lenin, Engels and Lenin and Trotsky, and Sam Marcy, our chairperson, who brought it up to modern times, our understanding of our trade union perspectives and its relationship to the overall class struggle. And as we now move into the 21st century, the potential for struggle based upon, once again, the concessions and the repression that existed, as I described, through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, where class collaboration seemed to be what everybody looks at, not from down below, where small groups of workers moved the mountains that constituted the ruling class in corporate America. And this is the lessons of my talk, of what happened during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. That's it.
For questions, especially to Milt, and also, additions to the discussion. Bill?
Just a couple of things. In the post office strike of 70, one of the most key roles that we played in that was in the American Servicemen's Union, because the ASU was active inside the Army. And we agitated to the GI and told them, urging them to sabotage the mail that they were told, and a lot of them did. And that was a key help we were able to give. But you can't really talk, you also, if you're talking about the struggles of the 70s, another important aspect of it in that strike wave, which was coming as, the U.S. economy is reeling under the impact of its defeat in Vietnam, U.S. imperialism's defeat in Vietnam, was a lot of leftists coming out of the anti-war movement were going into the plants consciously, and that was one of them. But even more important was the tremendous upsurge among black workers and rank-and-file movements among black workers in auto and steel, like the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement in Detroit, the Elrod Revolutionary Union movement, the United Black Brothers out in Mahwah, the Black Workers for Justice, which several farmers went down to attend their banquet, was formed in that period. And steel, auto, in that period, were powerhouses of black labor. And not just steel, auto, many industries. And these rank-and-file movements, which were reinforced by a lot of GIs coming back from Vietnam who've been involved in rebellions, mostly black GIs who've been involved in rebellions inside the military, sometimes of a very militant character, were getting jobs in the plants. And these movements were very much under the influence of the the Black Liberation Struggle, the Black Panther Party, and so on, that legacy. And in Detroit, there were numerous wildcats, for example, by black workers. So I remember one time a worker locked himself in this cage on the assembly line and just shut down the whole plant. And the bureaucracy, the union bureaucracy, while it wanted to survive and had to fight the bosses to a certain extent, they also felt threatened by the black workers rank-and-file movements that came up in that period, which there were also general movements that involved whites and Latinos and other workers, and they did a lot to they often would aim more fire at the black workers than they would at the bosses. Also, it's important in the 80s that the change in the situation where strikes became harder to win. was not the reactionary policies of the Reagan administration against labor were reinforced by the tremendous reindustrialization, the vast automation and layoffs that took place in that period, which were really a response to they wanted to cut the power of the labor movement. They were afraid of the radical forces growing up inside it, especially the black forces. A lot of the plants in Detroit were closed in that period. And just to give a concrete example, one strike I was involved in, a plant I worked at for a while was the Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock, which was 40,000 workers. It was the biggest capitalist-owned shipyard in the world. And it was about half black at the time. And they went on strike for 6 months in 1978 and won. It was a non-union plant. They won a union. The steel workers came in. Now that plant still exists, and they had a strike last year, which they also won a good wage increase, which is mostly military work. But that plant is now down to 8,000 workers, just because of the automation and not enough workers being sent. You know, the labor bureaucracy likes to focus on the jobs going overseas, because that coincides with the chauvinism often. But the biggest loss of jobs has been technological restructuring right here in the States, and which was causing the raise the whole perspective of the need for a broader struggle, going beyond just the plant struggles. Let's get ahead.
I want to comment on it.
It's a very important point.
Is it always inappropriate for the government to issue the injunction to prevent strike action?
Inappropriate or appropriate?
Inappropriate. You hear my question?
Yeah, is it always inappropriate for the government to intervene against the strike, to prevent a strike? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Maybe take a few more questions and then we can answer.
This is the question.
Okay.
I really want to thank the start off. It's so important you know, this class. It's so wonderful. But I wanted to add something that Milt touched on, and that is the international situation, which is so important. See, in 1970, when the postal workers won, the United States was getting its ass kicked in Vietnam, which means that they had their best minds concerned with that, and they were, the ruling class was demoralized, and the oppressed, even if they're not conscious of it, take heart from it and feel strengthened by it, and you can see that the ruling class can be had. On the other hand, what was going on with the PATCO in 1980? And the working class had just suffered one of its biggest defeats and setbacks the year before, with China invading Vietnam. Which I remember Sam writing about it. It was just a terribly demoralizing thing. And that laid, in my mind, the basis for a whole series of aggressive actions by the ruling class, and the feeling that the oppressed could be had, and that the oppressed could lose, that the ruling class could go on the offensive.
In reference to the postal strike, I had just been around the party, I guess, about 2 years or a little less. And I had been in my job just shy of 10. And I was active in my shop with 2 other members of the party at the time. And as we all know, that sometimes that facts and stuff educate workers faster than some other stuff. And I can remember a fact that came out of that strike that helped me to get some people to understand, because even as workers in a union, they were misguided with the fact that these people were out on strike and they were breaking the law. And they didn't know how to take that. And you got to remember that where I worked, we had just gone through a 77-day strike in 67, 68. So we're not that many years away. And Congress, at the time of the strike, by the postal workers, gave themselves 100% increase in salary at the same type as the postal workers went on strike. And I can remember using that fact. How does somebody as rich as they are give themselves 100% increase in salary and deny workers a fair wage? In 1978, when Milt had mentioned about people sitting in and stuff like that, from discussions here and stuff, it was proposed in my union at the time of the struggle, and we stayed in the plant, we stayed in our shop, and the company had to bring the quote-unquote New York's finest in to take us out of the plant, out of the shop, and took us down to the old slip police station, and I guess there was about 120 or 130 people all in one cell block that we spent for the rest of the day. And we had taken that from some of the lessons that we had taken from here back into the shop at the time. So it's very, I think it's very timely that unfortunately from 1982 for me and right up until now, because I called my old job, fortunately for me I'm retired now, but I called my old shop. Their contract was up March 31st. I called last Monday, the 4th. And the guys I talked to said it had been on the 31st and the 1st was the first time a union official had come around to tell them what was going on with the negotiations, which I thought was a total outrage. No communication whatsoever. I know it's a small unit now and stuff, because we went from 1963, we went from over 5,000 people, went down to 300 and something worldwide. So, you know, because we had WD, what used to be known as WD, and us in the same local, and we lost WD to the CWA in the raid in 1965. So, and we've got, since about 1980, right up to now, we've come down to maybe 300 to 400 people at the max that run the whole communications business where I work. The collaboration, or that Milt made such great reference to, is really gets prevalent right now. So, how do you go with the negotiations and not tell people what's going on?
Jesse.
So the thing that this United Labor Action, which I guess was initiated by the party, I mean, I'm sure there's a whole history to it in and of itself, but just like sort of maybe a brief synopsis of what the thought was in regards to its creation and what it did. Because I'm always curious about what, I don't know if this is the right word, but intervention by, you know, our forces into the labor movement, how, when, why, where, so to speak.
I want to make a comment. I used to be with the CPUSA, and during the last election cycle, I used to be with the CPUSA. During the last election cycle, we were working with the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, and the Here Unite Union to elect John Kerry. Now, I had troubles with the party based on their electoral policy, which is why I'm not very close to them these days. So, it's a very tricky issue. What do you do right now politically? What's appropriate now? It's not a very easy thing to answer, you know. You know, I didn't like the Kerry platform, but I voted for him anyway because I hated Bush even more. And essentially, that's what the party's argument was at the time.
Well, that is an extremely important difference that the Workers' World Party has with the Communist Party. In fact,
Sharon, who's talking to Mike?
For over a year, Workers' World newspaper spent a majority of the time answering this question of why the independent working class movement should not support the Democratic Party and Kerry, and was really in many ways a polemic with the Communist Party. So I would suggest that you check out many of the articles that we wrote in 2004. And what Workers' World Party did was run our own national presidential election campaign, an independent socialist campaign. So we felt that the most important thing was to show the need for an independent struggle of our class, and not to, be swept into the support for either of the capitalist parties. But I don't think that this class is on this subject in particular. There may be something that would be helpful that Milt may want to say, or others, about the terrible impact that the fact that the AFL-CIO spent, millions, tens of millions, maybe 100 million on support for the Democratic Party and Kerry rather than in the working class struggle, and, for example, did not adequately support the Million Worker March because all of their efforts had to go into try to campaign for Kerry. So, certainly that kind of class collaborationist by the AFL-CIO every 4 years has had a terribly detrimental impact on the labor struggle. And, we certainly would like to see independence and any kind of show of independence like the Million Worker March that up against this sentiment that you had to go with the lesser evil. They broke free of that, and in spite of the fact that it was only 1 month before the election, called for a national demonstration to show that there needed to be an independent labor voice. So, and we did everything we could do to support that, not only because it was an important demonstration with all of its demands, but that because very precisely it was a show of independence from that political class collaborationist sentiment of the AFL-CIO in support of Kerry. So, yeah, but I think what we want to do is go around. I think there's a couple, okay.
The Communist Party broke with the Democrats and supported the Progressive Party of Henry Wallace. It's a huge disaster.
It was a huge disaster? No, we thought that was one of the better things it did.
It was a progressive development, but it was a huge disaster because it served to turn the Democratic Party decisively to the right. That's why.
No, you're raising big questions, and I think we should just go back because he's been in the CP and.
Right. Yeah.
Why don't we finish going around and seeing what the other questions or comments might be, and then I actually, for me at least, I mean, Milt, obviously, I respect whatever you want to do, but then I'd like to sort of maybe, if you can, respond to some of the points already raised, and then we could go around again.
Yeah, I like that. Okay, so is there anybody who hasn't spoken? All right, and then let's, like, get back to, you know.
I do want to hear, I couldn't hear exactly what you said. I would like you to develop your ideas about Henry Wallace and the Progressive Party and later on. But anyway.
Yeah, I think we could just repeat it for you, okay? And then,
We'll take up one aspect of your background, your past. Okay, maybe I'll just go over it. Anyway, whatever you like to do.
Okay, anyway, just a few comments. So happy about this discussion, especially when you emphasize that the role of a small union, a small number of workers can be really very crucial and vital in the overall class struggle. The PE workers in Austin, Minnesota, and the heroic struggle that they carried on. I can remember back to those days when we supported them in New York City. They had a flatbed. They had a flatbed truck right there on Park Avenue set up. I don't know what office we were picketing in support of the PE workers. We showed support for them. Anyway, that idea of a small union, small number working, being a spark, reminds me of what Mao Zedong said about a single spark to light a prairie fire. And we should always remember that. And that's why in this piece by Lenin, he clearly emphasized the fact that we got to pay very, very close attention to the strike picture that develops. I mean, that year, 1970, what was 1970 when reached a total of over 2 million workers that were on strike in plants, over 1,000 workers. But anyway, the dynamic of the working class is something I always admire. It's magnificent. When I covered the 32B, 32J struggle, I can never forget that, because there I was in front of the Manhattan Center, which was the place where the workers were taking a vote whether to go out. And it was an amazing, amazing sight to see the workers come out of the subways, go into the hall, vote.
this is just a couple months ago.
Yeah, there's some.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I thought you were talking about their strike that 10, 15 years ago. No, you're talking about the recent strike vote.
Yeah, the recent strike. And without going into the analysis of that vote, Bilky did a very good analysis of it. But tying it in with the obstacles to the working class expressing itself, I can't get out of my mind what happened this past Thursday, where almost 10,000 workers came out, hospital workers, and they were looking for something. They were looking for a road to struggle. And we were there with our paper and with the leaflet announcing May Day. And the workers were just grabbing the leaflet, so they were grabbing the paper. And there on the platform is Dennis Rivera. And he is blessing the bureaucrats in Albany, and Sheldon Silver is there, and they are throwing kisses back to him. And there was a mutual admiration society. The question is, what?
And the hospital boss.
And the hospital bosses were there too. Yeah. They were all there. What?
Yeah.
It was incredible, the only thing, when you bring out 10,000, 11,000 workers, the only thing you can say is that's a betrayal of the working class. Enthusiasm for something to do. They're shutting down the hospitals. And here they're kissing, that's not a political expression, but they're kissing ass. That's what it is. So anyway, this is a very refreshing going back into the history of the labor movement, and it's encouraging. And what's most, of course, encouraging is the fact that in North Carolina, just a week or so ago, was the meeting of the Black Workers for Justice, which was so, the UE was there. UE representatives were there. FIST was there, UE was there, and we were there. And that was so encouraging. And I really feel that we're entering into a period where the struggle is going to break out. It'll be good for small unions, small numbers, or bigger numbers of workers.
Okay. A bill for his contribution in regard to the development of black caucuses during the course of these years. And the lesson that I felt in terms of a party, a multinational party like ours that was trying to penetrate the trade union movements during the 70s, and I'll take up your point about the ULA in that respect. Helping black caucuses coming out of the Vietnam War, and subsequently the issue for the party in combining the national question of black and Latino and other workers of color to the class question was very, very important during these periods, and I'm glad you raised it. To me, in my experiences, and some of the other comrades that worked in this area of trying to help the black caucuses inside the labor movement, the key question for us, in my judgment, was the lack of support from the white workers. That the key to the strengthening of black caucuses lies with the solidarity from white workers. That's been lacking. And even in the anti-war movement, those militants and progressives that came out of the Vietnam War, I'll give an example of at least my own experiences. In the Marwa struggle of a black group of, I forget their names over the years. Huh? United Black Brothers. When we went up to Marwa on a number of occasions, I think, as a matter of fact, if my memory serves me, Key Martin, I went with Key Martin, who was a member, one of the leading comrades in the party, who died. What did I see was the problem, see? Yes, it was the labor bureaucracy. See? But we were working with SDS during that period, trying...
What year was it?
Was it six?
Before we met people in the plant.
Carl was in the plant. Carl Glenn.
I don't think so, not yet.
Oh, well, my memory isn't exactly on target, but I know Carl was in that plant for a number of years and carried out. See, what was the problem? The problem was that SDS, and we went up with Mark, who? Mark Rudd, yes. Yes, Students for Democratic Society. I went up there with Mark Rudd. See. And they didn't get how do we develop white solidarity with the black workers, because really what happened during that course of that struggle, they were mainly second shift workers, as I remember them, see, that didn't able to reach into the daytime plant where white workers predominantly had the seniority, and they couldn't get in there. They couldn't get a handle in it as black brothers. And that was our job. And SDS was thinking of, you know, the revolution coming out of the black struggle. See? That it was doomed to fail if we couldn't get the white workers' support. They couldn't have held out. Why? Is because, first of all, they were boxed in on a second shift. They had the labor bureaucracy against them. And they had the company because they walked out. See? We used to block that bridge there, entering and handing out leaflets to the white workers on the first shift. Because you had to go over a bridge or something, I don't remember, to get off the main highway into Mahwah, New Jersey, and to get into the plant. Okay. So what you're raising is very important as a lesson for what is needed today in regard to our relationship to black leadership in the Million Worker March. How do we get white workers? Otherwise, it's got problems. See? The black workers can't do it by themselves, no matter how revolutionary they are, while at the same time we support the national and the right of self-determination for black workers to carry out their liberation. See? So if it's anything that I learned about, and drum, of course, I wasn't as familiar with drum that the comrades in Detroit were involved in. It was a Dodge revolutionary.
Black workers, the Dodge Plan in Detroit.
See, but it was very good that you brought this up. See, because that's exactly where we're at, in a way, in this critical period of building unity and at the same time recognizing national oppression and black leadership and self-determination. The other experience of the party, that's different from the Communist Party, since you're raising it, but it has nothing to do with what you said, is during the struggle in Ocean Hill-Brownsville. See? Ocean Hills-Brownsville, this is important because what you're bringing up are the critical questions, which I'm glad, since we're getting into them, we might as well explore them. See? And with a lot of your own experiences that you had in Virginia, in a right-to-work state, that was able to organize a union of steelworkers of half black. At least they looked more black, more than half black to me when I was down there. Yeah, yeah. I remember when we went down there, it was incredible. It was the organizing drive. It wasn't a union yet. You were there? Okay. But Ocean Hill-Brownsville, what was the differences between us and the CP and the SWP? Was this. Albert Schenker was president of the union, of the UFT, United Federation of Teachers. See? And he felt threatened. His union, why? Is because Rory, I forget his name, the head of the Ocean Hill-Brownsville, had decided to set up their own community control inside Ocean Brownsville and provide black teachers with seniority that exceeded those of white teachers who they felt were racist to the children. Okay? And lo and behold, Albert Schenker said, you're challenging the sacred of seniority? This is the cornerstone of our labor movement. And we said, no. Self-determination and community control is more important than seniority, and we'll figure that out once we all support the right of self-determination and community control of a black community led by a black leadership. Schenker decided to set up a picket line. We discussed here in New York who could go and help out. That was the only picket line I crossed in my life, if you want to call it a picket line. See? A bunch of us, including F.O. Richardson, who's not around, who we decided to go in and ask, what can we do to keep the schools going? The CP attacked us for crossing a picket line. The CP supported the Schenker line. Oh yes, oh yes. So did PL. Huh? PL supported what? You bet they did. So did the CP support the picket line. So did the SWP. And said, you don't cross a picket line. And we said it's a racist picket line. See? So the question that it's to develop comes out of our experiences in regard to the class question and the national question, which takes priority in a particular struggle over a contract with a union. See? Now, so to just sum up, you go around again. The key question is white workers who have to learn. And I have to tell you, we're in struggles in Boston and other places where we're pushing up from struggles of black self-determination to get white workers and even the AFL-CIO in an area to support a black struggle for community control, and it can work. You can push from the bottom and move them. You don't get their complete unconditional support. But the changing character of the workforce now, which is, we all know, we studied the changing character. I was glad you raised the technological revolution that began in the 70s, and Sam wrote on it in 1984 with high-tech, low-pay. The whole changing character of the workforce has enabled us, where it's more multinational, service-oriented now, low-paid, unfortunately, oppressed more than the high-skilled workers that I talked about and worked in myself. We were the higher-paid workers in the steel industry, in auto industry. It's all cheroot. It's all over. See, as we all know, this is ABC. So the opportunity for unity based upon the leadership that we're supporting in the Million Worker March, as opposed to what the CP did, this is just parenthetically what Sharon raised, we supported the Million Worker March rather than to support the Kerry movement. See, the Kerry movement took for granted that the AFL-CIO would support them. So they had their own program. They ignored the AFL-CIO in the course of the election. You hardly could get Kerry to come and meet with Sweeney. You would think, with all the money that Sweeney put up and the millions of workers, as Sharon described, that Kerry's forces would even demagogically say, what can we do for you in the program? Instead, he was for advancing the Iraq war. So we can talk more about that, though. Now, the question that I think you raised a little earlier, which is not totally clear, but see if I understand it, about the government.
Let's say the firefighters decided they wanted to go in. That would absolutely present a dangerous situation for a lot of innocent people in the city. Would you allow the government to break the strike?
Okay. Very good. Well, let me tell you something that happened in 1917. It was very unusual. But communists supported a police strike in Boston because they felt, now by the way, this is very unique and exceptional, but there are sometimes exceptional circumstances. And you're raising a hypothetical case of a fire of a group, which I'm glad it's better than the cops, see, because right now there's no question that we would oppose any state agency of repression, whether they're fighting for economic gains. We would oppose them, see, and create our own community control of the community patrolling their own communities. This is a revolutionary demand that we've raised years and years ago. It hasn't yet materialized, but ultimately there has to be black control of their communities, and the state, represented by the cops, are a repressive force in the communities, as you well know, based on your own history and your experiences. And the CP always had a pretty good position on that. One more point I'd like to raise that you raised.
Communists supported a police strike in Boston.
Yeah, 1970.
Can you get Communist Party? Because I don't think it was World Party.
No, we didn't exist.
Not 1970.
Okay, I'll tell you. 1970.
Yeah.
1917.
1917?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, that,
I thought you said 1970, and I'm...
oh no,
I
no.
remember, but it wasn't then, it was a few years earlier. Sam Archie wrote this wonderful article called The Year of the Pig, where the police either were going to go on strike or were threatening strike, and there were some, oh, was it a stick out, and there were some in the movement, including the Communist Party, who said, oh, they're workers, and so they should be supported, and Sam just blasted them and said,
Oh, sure.
that
Did I say 1970?
yeah, that the police are not workers, and that we would not support them.
No, this is
okay,
in
that
Boston.
they're part of the repressive apparatus of the state.
This is
so, okay, so you're saying
17.
Okay.
Okay. And anyway, it was the it was a communist movement that was yet to be born, really. Huh? And also the see, the communist movement, the 1919, but the communist movement started with our history of our party and your history that was led by William Forster and James Cannon. See? Cannon represented our tendency. Forster represented your tendency. And that was the birth of the Communist Party. Yes, yes. Although he went through a lot of Caesar's eggs, unfortunately. The better. He was a trade union leader, a magnificent trade union leader, led a number of strikes, like the steel strike and so on. I want to just answer quickly a question you raised about the Wallace campaign, and you said you thought that it was a mistake. Yeah, sure, I can understand why you would say that. Yeah, I can understand why you would say that, because in a way you're looking at it from the point of view that it split the movement and weakened the left and enabled Truman to win the election. See? Well, that's not altogether true. See? Although logically you can say that. But from a class point of view, you see, the Cold War was going full blast. The end of the Second World War did not end the war. It began the war against the Soviet Union. See? And if, as a matter of fact, because I was in, see, I got an advantage over you. I was there. See, but I'm only kidding. After the Second World War, U.S. wanted to go up and take on the Soviet Union, who was moving into Asia. Soviet troops that had won in the struggle toward moving across Eastern Europe were now regrouping and moving their forces up into Asia. Asia, says the U.S., after we may even lose Eastern Europe because the troops got to Berlin, that was a no-no. They dropped the bomb on Japan to end it quickly and regrouped to start the Cold War, and would have started the hot war, in my judgment, but couldn't. You know why? Because GIs in Europe, who had been fighting for 4 years, wanted to come home. And they were rebelling. And they were in no mood to shift from Europe to Manchuria, see, or all different parts of Asia that the Soviet Union was regrouping their forces. And they had to accede to the rebellions of GIs in Bordeaux, France, in other parts from England. We wanted to come out on points. They told us we had points, and if you got points, you come home. So we wanted to come home. And that had to regroup for the Cold War, not the hot war. Now, Wallace, who was a vice president, see, himself of a Roosevelt, earlier Roosevelt presidency, and was Secretary of Commerce later on. He's a bourgeois. But he was against the U.S. in regard to their Cold War politics. And he accepted that was very important, that internationally he was putting up a campaign that would support the Soviet Union from the point of view that the U.S. should be restrained from entering into this new stage that led from the Marshall Plan and all the other developments where the U.S. was directing its attention to the Soviet Union. So it was progressive politically, see. And what happened was he Wallace won over the left wing of the CIO because the CIO was still hostile, see, was still in a progressive development in a way. In a way. See. When I say in a way, I'm meaning the left unions that I just described that got expelled, like UE, Mine Mill and Smelter, textile workers, all these unions, and there was a huge, that got expelled from the AFL, from the CIO, sorry, the AFL wasn't involved, joined the Wallace campaign. So a left development was trying to be sustained inside the Wallace campaign, both politically and economically, because they were isolated. And they could regroup inside the Wallace campaign, the UE and so on, see. And that was a good development for us as communists. Not to give unconditional support to Wallace, who was he was a capitalist politician. But he at least took the position that I just described. And we look forward to a regroupment from our point of view, the party point of view, because we knew we were entering a period of the Cold War that would be brutal to the left. And if we could work out a regroupment, even under a Wallace campaign, and our chairperson, Sam Marcy, wrote about this. We were in the SWP, and we fought the SWP on that said, don't go in there because the Stalinists are running the Wallace campaign. That's what the characterization was of the CP in the other movements. See, so we were for going into the movement, into the not in an unconditional way, but in a way of regrouping and helping the regroupment to survive what we saw as a period that's going to be brutal to the workers, starting with the Cold War, 1950, After Taft-Hartley of 47, then Eisenhower came in, the Korean War started, and you had to almost go underground as communists, including your own party, which was the victims. I was close to the party in those days. See, I came in a different way into our movement, but I knew what the CP was going through during the 50s, and we supported the CP, even though we had disagreements with them, see, on the basis of the witch hunt. See, and the fact that they were going to jail and underground and so on and so forth. But their demise was too much support for the official Democratic Party, even in those days. They were the campaign people. They were the foot soldiers for the Democratic Party.
Well, supporting Roosevelt.
Huh?
I don't think supporting Roosevelt was inappropriate at the time.
Well, we can raise that in a different way, but I'm talking about a different period. See, I'm talking about the period when the Democratic Party turned on the CP. Truman turned on them. The loyalty oaths were passed. The things that I raised. So I want to get to your question, see. I'd like to handle that. See, 1970, oh. I'll wait for him to come back. We should have a lot more discussions off because it's not, it's hard to redirect the theme of our talk today into what I'm very pleased to have you here as a former member of the CP, see, to have further discussions, though, with some of our leading comrades here. In 1970, as I described, we saw a glimpse of this upsurge that I described earlier, with the increase in strikes and so on and so forth. And Sam, our chairperson, wrote a document in 71, in which, I'm paraphrasing everything, he in essence was saying, we've come through some hard times. The communist movement of all persuasions have been driven out of the trade unions for different reasons. We had to go deeper into the workers. I was in steel in those days in Lackawanna. We had to find ways to lead wildcats. No official union representation. We couldn't get, if I wanted to run for a steward and had the agreement of the members of the workers, you had to sign a loyalty oath. Finney Copeland, one of our national leaders, was driven out even though thousands of workers supported him in Lackawanna. We saw the handwriting on the wall. We were going to go through some tough years. See? But in 1970, Sam wrote a document. And in the document he said, hey, this is the time to come out. But we don't have much experience as being 10 or 15 years isolated, along with all the other organizations, communist and socialist organizations. We need to form something that the comrades would be able to participate, get the feel of what the workers were in 1970 because of what Bill was saying. They were coming home from the Vietnam War. Black workers, white workers were coming home. It was going down, the Vietnam War. Just like any war, all the money went to defense spending, so there was not going to be what a lot of the Social Democrats thought would happen in the 70s. See, what the Social Democrats thought would happen in the 70s was that there would be a peace dividend, that all that money that had gone to the war militarily, so take Seymour Melman, who was one of the protagonists, said, wow, There's going to be now class collaboration, stability. There's money now, no class struggle. And we said, absolutely not. The Nixon, the loss of Vietnam, the inflation and the stagnation of the economy would only intensify the attack on the workers. See? So we had to find some way to start the process of reaching the workers. The CP did it many years earlier when Foster organized the Trade Union Educational League that we talked about and the Trade Union Unity League, which that's another discussion. See? Okay. So Sam devised the idea of having labor centers, see, that would form in a way that workers beginning to act wouldn't necessarily say, oh, I want to join Workers' World. They're just beginning to feel their own oats and learn from their own experience. And we had another organization that was very militant called Youth Against War and Fascism, our youth movement. And Sam felt we needed a labor, see. So we formed the CULA. And for 22 years, until 1992, I brought in a lot of the leaflets here for another time, see, of all the different struggles we're in. But one of the key struggles that I want to mention that elevated the CULA because we learned a lot, we met a lot of workers, we recruited workers, we held an office, we used to have meetings in this office and discuss all the various struggles that were taking place and listening to the workers and getting educated ourselves after so many years of the Cold War. The one important struggle that the government took note of, see, was a small strike, see, in Texas called FARA. It was called the FARA Corporate Company. They make pants. See. You remember? Anyway, so here's what happened. We decided, as a CULA, here's a strike of small amount of workers in FARA, Texas, that were fighting for their lives, that we would then try to be helpful. So what did we do? See, that the government took note of. We said, it's not enough to boycott FARA. If you are a department store, like there was Corvettes in New York at that time, there was Sibley's in Rochester, we said, we don't just want to picket the pants, FARA pants, we're going to picket the whole goddamn store and shut it down if they're going to keep FARA pants inside that store. The government said, what the hell are you doing here? This is secondary boycott. This is against the law. There's the Taft-Hartley, there's the Landreth-Griffin. So they sued us. The government, through the National Labor Relations Board, came after this little organization about, I don't know how many comrades were then, involved in the CULA. There was Mike Tilley, who died, unfortunately, at a young age. Remember Bob Russo and, the whole group of you young comrades? Huh? Veronica, oh yeah. Oh, sure, there was a whole school. So the government said, we're gonna break this little group of CULA, the whole government, through the National Labor Relations Board. Why? Because you're violating the law. You're carrying out a secondary boycott for a store that don't have nothing to do with the strike in FARA. If you want to picket the pants and put up a sign and say, don't buy FARA pants, you could do that. But you want to shut the whole goddamn store down. We would go inside and, the clothes would be taken off the rack. There's ways you do things. So the company, so the government sued us. Millions of dollars. Wow, this was, you know, I don't think we had 10 cents. So we got our own lawyers, and we said, wait a minute. If you're suing us, we're not a union. We don't have any collective bargaining agreements. The Taft-Hartley, they're suing a union. I mean, if a union, and we were working quietly and secretly at that time with the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union that preceded what is now Unite, because that was the strike of Farrer. See, it was the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union. So we had a long fight with the government to prove that we were just expressing our free speech and our free assembly, and we had a constitutional right to do that. See? And we won. We finally won it. And all the law reviews, I have copies of it, all the law reviews, how could this happen? Wrote, why did the government let us off the hook? See? Why didn't they appeal it from the National Labor Relations Board into the federal courts, which is their right to do it if it's a constitutional question? But they decided not to. That is just a high point. That the CULA, which then we merged later on when we were building a movement for a people's assembly, we became part of it in 92, 91. But for 20 years, we learned so much through all these strikes that some of them I described, others Bill described, and Artie, and so on. So that was the CULA of the 70s that Sam saw as different from the peace dividend and the stability of the system, of the capitalist system. Rather, we should begin to prepare for strikes and struggles that I described in the brief, you know, in some of my comments. That's it.
Before we continue, I know that asked us to end at a certain time because he needs to be able to go and set up for the film showing tonight. What time is that?
What time?
What time is it?
We should
Can we
probably get out by 6.
Can we go to 6?
Yeah.
Okay, that's what I
That would
want.
be
Do people want to stay until 6 and continue the discussion? Mostly? Okay, well, you know, that's within 20 minutes, so let's see how far we go.
Speaking of the witch hunts, they're showing the crucible.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
All right. Another round of questions. You know, this is an opportunity mostly, you know, to hear Milt on the topic that he was covering, which is the, you know, last few decades of the labor struggle. But I want to put in a request, and that is that I don't think we have in one spot documented the struggle of Ocean Hill-Brownsville. It's sort of like all in our party's history, and we usually cover it, for example, when we have candidates classes as part of our, you know, reason that there are some times when we actually do not support a strike, like in this case of a racist strike. But I think that we should be, like, writing this up. So I just want to challenge Milt or someone else who maybe was in the party at that time to make a document, look back at the articles in Locust World, and I think this is like one of the very, very important struggles that we were involved in, because we did support for the community there. And there were comrades in the party who were teachers who crossed that picket line and taught children to keep the schools open.
Especially with the anniversary. I mean, it's a couple years away. The anniversary's kind of close.
Yeah, but let's write it now.
Exactly. This is going to take at least a year.
Yeah. So, Dave.
I'm going to make a comment that I always make when the notion of Brownsville is raised, and that is well, I wasn't in the party, but I was around the party and I must have been influenced by it, because I had a trained position on it. But I had a friend at the time who was a teacher, and his sister was in the Scouts, and we were kind of like fighting for him. And he didn't know what to do, because he'd been, I think he'd been in Red Diaper Baby or something. He was a lot progressive, and he could see both sides of the issues, and he didn't know what to do. But anyway, he finally crossed the picket line, and he went to work. And something happened that I think is absolutely unique in the history of strikes. And that is, the Board of Education didn't pay him during the strike, and it did pay the strikers. I don't think that has ever happened before or since. Which really, yeah, exactly. It shows you what, it really wasn't a strike until it was called a strike. But, you know, I think he must have finally got the money, you know, that was owed him. But the city did make that mistake. And it really shows that what happened was that the CP and those other organizations, Marx, whatever, they wound up on the side of the bosses, the state apparatus. They made a mistake, and they make a mistake entirely on that. I mean, it's a pretty consistent mistake that they make. You don't have like a high political understanding, and you have a kind of like, I don't know, I guess you call it an economist point of view.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay, no, I understand.
Take it.
I mean, it doesn't compare to that Ocean Brownsville thing, which of course I only know about hearing about, and Pacifica or BAI ran a whole thing with the tape, you know, from all the sides. You know, so you hear Shanker, you hear all the different people and except, you know, all that. Anyway, I just remember like, but it does come up, I mean, sort of in maybe a much smaller way. But I remember in the 90s, I guess, they were building that new NYU dorm that they bulldozed the Palladium, which was this great spot historically, culturally, and whatever, for particularly the Latino community. But anyway, so they put up that dorm, and I remember one of the student labor action group things, you know, which is great, you know, but they called for people to go, not picket, because it's not a union thing, but to go, like, demonstrate there, because evidently they were using non-union labor. And so I'm thinking, well, I'm pro-union, I support union, you know, labor, whatever. But then you go there, and then it was some of the construction trades, and, you know, I'm, you know, mixed in my family. One side's people of color, one side's white, etc. And I remember I had so many relatives that were in the construction trades in New York, which are lily white. And even to this day, to a certain extent, are lily white. Okay, there have some more black workers because of the fact that there was mobilization in regards to the racist practices. Some women because of lawsuits, good or bad in regards to how those things happen. But, you know, and I sort of thought, well, I want to support this, but, you know, these unions don't really bring in, and because primarily, the workers on the site were primarily Chinese workers. And yeah, I'm sure they were exploited. They definitely weren't union, obviously, etc. But I'm like thinking, you will never see a large percentage of them, at least at that time. Maybe it's changed, in some of the construction trades. So to me, I think it is important to bring up the, you know, the term, you know, sometimes it has to be explained, I think, to people, but say the national question. Because it's not anti-labor to bring up the national question if labor itself is hurting itself by not being fully inclusive of all working class people, you know. And so I'm actually glad to hear that history, you know, because for me that don't know was I remember taking labor studies class at my college, right? And I was able to do college thing through a scholarship and through the fact that my father benefited from being in a union, right, in regards to access to scholarships and things like that. But the way they taught the labor history sort of was, sometimes it was sort of like they sometimes glossed over any of the racial dynamics in the labor movement, which I thought was really problematic because realistically, you take an ethnic studies course, you quickly find out about it. And the idea, it has to be handled in a complex, sophisticated way so we don't replicate the same mistakes. Anyway, to make a long story short, I'm glad to hear about the examples. In particular, I think what would be useful maybe for a future class because I think this was all great and there's only so much that can be gone over in a short class. But particularly this thing around these caucuses of people of color, black workers, Latino workers, etc., in the history of the labor movement, and times when there was even different types of labor formations. Like, because right now there is the whole phenomenon of labor centers again, community labor centers primarily for immigrant workers. So I'd be curious about that development and like, how does it, I mean, because you do bring up a good point. What do you do? Like, so there's, you know, some people that just say you got to organize alternative unions, but that's not exactly taking off. Then some people say you got to reform the AFL-CIO. And then some people are doing the community labor center stuff. So, you know, like, what is the angle, like, to sort of do? I'm not saying that has to be answered now, but those would be some of my questions. Sorry, it was a little long.
Very important to raising these critical questions for today.
Anybody else?
Construction is kind of a unique thing in New York. I mean, the construction unions are kind of have a unique structure, craft structure. It's not an industrial structure. It's what the CIO was formed for a better sense, but that structure still prevails in construction largely. I was in construction for a couple of years, and we had the laborers union in Virginia, which was mostly black. But New York is kind of, it's a unique, not unique, but it's even probably worse than other parts of the country for a lot of reasons. We supported the struggle of black workers to break into construction. We sat in 62, y'all held sit-ins at the plumbers union to demand we hire black workers. And of course, what really finally integrated the construction unions to a certain extent, at least some of them, was what was called the coalitions, which were also leftist-led. A guy like Bill Everton played an important role in that. Who would actually go and physically close down job sites in Harlem and other oppressed communities if they didn't hire black and Latino workers. Of course, these same construction unions attacked in the anti-war movement in the 1970s. Well, we had physical attacks by construction unions on left demonstrations. It was a frequent thing in the city. These were, of course, organized by the bosses and in collaboration with the bosses. And that's
Probably the government.
and the government too, yeah, Nixon regime. But yeah, but there's a lot happening in construction now too, and there's more of a basis for struggle inside those unions now because there are larger, at least in some of them, larger numbers of oppressed people because of the past struggles.
Yeah, I mean, there's a big distinction between the laborers union, for example, and the electrical workers union. You'll see that at the Labor Day marches, you know, that one is, you know, much more working class and multinational, where the electricians are still the elite, you know, thousands and thousands of all white workers, white male workers, and you just like, it's just astounding, you know. I mean, the simple answer is, what, you know, our question is, why aren't they organizing all of these unorganized workers? Why aren't they getting them into their union rather than, you know, I mean, certainly we're non-union construction sites, but there's got to be more outreach to get them. I mean, these workers would probably love to be union, have union jobs. You know, why aren't they getting them in? It's hurting the union that they're not.
Why not
Instead of being so exclusive.
Why not create organizations organized and unorganized? The AFL-CIO is not doing it. Why shouldn't we?
Let me just take up was said previously for your that very honest appraisal of the problem and how complex it is and where your loyalties lie, following what Bill and Sharon have said. It's a process that we take into account because of the whole history that preceded inside the craft unions that go all the way back to the discussions we had when the CIO was formed And the whole question of industrial unions, that itself took a century almost to be able to get us industrial unions in this country from where the crafts were at under Gompers and the subsequent leaders of the AFL. Sometimes it's good to start from something concrete in a complex way like that. Let me give you an example of what I mean. We got a call from a group of black workers who worked in the construction trades. And they were so isolated and didn't know what to do in regard to the leadership because the craft unions have what you call closed shops. See, a closed shop is a progressive development until somebody takes them over that has a racist or anti-woman mentality and then picks and chooses who they should select in the jobs that are posted that come in from a company, a construction company, on a day-to-day basis. There's what you call a labor pool. And there are workers who have their permanent jobs based upon at least a minimum of seniority, but there's also an awful lot of jobs that come into the closed shop, and the workers go down there and look for the jobs that they bid in for bidding purposes. It was in steel in the early days when I was in steel. Only it was run by the company and the foreman, not a union bureaucrat. Well, we said, look, let's get together and form a caucus, a fraction of black workers, see, to assert our rights, and we'll help you. See? So that we elevated, for example, a lot of the jobs that the bureaucracy saw that they could pick up the phone and say, look, there's these jobs to their friends, come in. Don't even come to the closed shop, to the office, to the union office and bid. Just go to the job. So we met with them, a nice group of them, and we decided that we would pressure the union that were violating not only the contract but some of the laws that do exist on the books. But hey, if it's for the it's for the benefit of reaction and racism, well, it's okay. Anyway, to make the long story short, we were able to put enough pressure on them because we attacked the leadership here, not so much the companies that they worked with, but to attack the bureaucracy internally in bettering the relationships of black workers. And what happened was we forced them, and that's what a struggle is about, see? That's what struggle is about. We forced them to say that they wouldn't do that, but that they would have a pool, a sort of a lobby. You come in and pick numbers out. And if you pick a number that's low, you can bid for the jobs. This was their concession, see? And we said, well, that isn't good enough, see? You got to go on the basis that these black workers have some rights. Some of them are senior and some of them are not. And the struggle went on, see? This is preparatory to the problem of when you see a construction site and the big rat is out and there's a picket line around, and who's walking through the picket line are third world workers who need jobs. And that's what the case you're describing, see? It's a terrible development. But we have to do it in terms of a process, see, that elevates strength of unity between black and white and a communist approval and win over some of the better elements. And at the same time, the bureaucracy on the basis of those struggles are getting more sensitive to this problem. I'll tell you what they do. They now hire black and Latino workers per diem to be the picketers rather than the whites yelling at the scabs that they're black and calling them scabs. So the more multinational picket lines under the pressure is forcing the bureaucracy to open it up, even if it's in a modest way, see? And then you have the more militant wing of the black movement, like Jim Houghton from, what was the name of the organization? Harlem Fight Back. And we supported that too, where they just shut it down. They'll shut down an operation. In the old days, when Houghton was younger, there would be a confrontation with the whites workers, and what would it do? It would shake up the bosses, because they were on a cost contract to build the goddamn buildings, and the confrontation didn't help them one bit. So they started to lean on the white labor leaders. You better open up some doors here. That's what we're doing in Boston. See? We're doing exactly this in Boston. And it can work if you don't draw the conclusion before you develop the process. See? That's the important thing. Otherwise, it strengthens the hostilities that could develop where we can find openings between more progressive whites and more sensitive to the black issue. See, that's the key.
That seems like a great